What's up, world? This is Maxwell 3000 Productions. I am Maxwell 3000. I'm back again with my big bro, Tommy Dixon, for another edition of Book Club. What's up, Tommy? How are you this morning?
Pretty good, bro. How you doing this morning?
Man, I'm well. I'm well. I'm blessed. The sun is shining. It may rain later, but it's cool right now. Um,
Been a beautiful week, though, hasn't it?
yeah, it has, really has, man.
Yeah.
Talk about some blessings for sure.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited today about who the author that we're looking at and the subject for today. We've chosen to review The Sea Wolf by Jack London. Um, Jack London is one of, if not America's favorite authors. We think about American authors and maybe the first celebrity authors, and Mark Twain is definitely a big name in that. Edgar Allan Poe was maybe the first American that was successful at being a writer by vocation, but he wasn't necessarily a celebrity in his life. Um, Jack London was the guy. I mean, as far as what we may consider today as a movie star or a big headliner celebrity, Jack London was the guy. So born January 12th, 1876, so right before the country's about to be 100. And kind of looking at that time, 1876, it's kind of right in the middle of Reconstruction into the Gilded Age, and his life spans from that time into the modern era or the early progressive era of the United States. So really, his life story kind of parallels the American story very well. Um, so I said, obviously, he was a famous American novelist, a journalist, and really considered a pioneer in commercial fiction and magazines. He was an outspoken advocate. He was a socialist and an advocate for workers' rights. He was also an environmentalist and an advocate for animal rights and for sustainable agriculture, which is something that we kind of talk about a lot today. But when he was doing it in the early 20th century, it was kind of unheard of in America. When we talked about him kind of introducing this, and I asked what you thought of when you thought of Jack London, and you said he was an adventurer, and he really was. And he is said to be someone that lived many lives, and he died November 22nd, 1916. So you do the math, he was 40 years old. You know what I'm saying? And to think he lived many lives in a very short span of time. Um, I'll just get into his family a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit about his life. He was born into a rough situation. His father, William Cheney, was an astrologer. And, we think, like, I think of Miss Cleo on the TV in the 90s in the middle of the night with the, 1-900 number. So his father was an astrologist, kind of looked to the stars for more prophetic or spiritual information. His mother, Flora Wellham, was a spiritualist. And now I didn't really know what a spiritualist meant in the context. To me, I kind of think of just somebody that is spiritual, maybe into different religions and different aspects of life in that matter. But in the 19th century, a spiritualist was someone who was said to be able to speak with the dead and held these seances and stuff like that. So he was born into kind of hippity dippity type folks, I guess. It's kind of unclear whether his folks were married at the time. There are some reports that they were, but there was never like a marriage license that was produced for historical evidence. And they weren't together very long. When Flora was pregnant, William encouraged her to have an abortion, and she tried. Some say she tried a few different ways. Well, one way was she tried to shoot herself, and did shoot herself, but just barely grazed her in the head, and she survived, and the child survived. So obviously, not a good situation he was born into, right? And his mother was under a lot of mental and emotional stress. She didn't even nurse the child. She sent Jack to a neighbor, and I want to get this name right, Virginia Prentice, I think was her name, Virginia Prentice, who was their neighbor, and this is in Oakland, California, who was an ex-slave and was actually young John Chaney at this time, wet nurse. And as later, London described her as the only source of nurturing affection that he had in his young life. And she was actually a big support during his later life as well. So very soon after young London was born, his mother married his stepfather, Jack London, who he ends up taking his name, obviously. Jack London Sr. was a partially disabled Civil War vet, and really they had a working class household. You would not call it middle class, but not quite as maybe impoverished as Jack maybe led on later in his writing. But he did grow up in a hard life where he had to start working pretty early on, around 13, in a cannery to help support the family. So he's working in this industrial environment at a very young age, and he ends up hanging around. It's a very famous bar that's actually kind of named after him now, in Oakland. Anyways, he starts hanging around this bar where a lot of sailors and oyster pirates hang out at. And so he gets to thinking like, hey man, this cannery job ain't the business. I'm going to go over and I'm going to do this oyster pirate thing. And oyster pirates, it's what you think of when you hear that. They go around and poaching oysters from beds that are owned by other people or other corporations. And so he borrows like $300, which is a lot of money, at the time, from Miss Prentice, his nursemaid, and buys this little bitty boat, and goes out and is an oyster pirate in the San Francisco Bay. And kind of mixed reports. There's some biographers that say he was successful in this. There's others that say that he wasn't, and it wasn't but a few months, and he had tore his boat up and really wasn't able to engage in the pirating much longer. But like he did, he wrote in somewhat of a romantic view of his time, and made the statement that other pirates and other sailors referred to him as the prince of the oyster pirates. So whether he was a prince of the oyster pirates or he banged his boat up pretty quick and let it go. He did that, and then kind of right after that, he switched teams on them, and he was working for the California Fishery and Wildlife, and he was patrolling the bay and reporting on oyster pirates and other nefarious type activity. So he switched up, and we don't really know a whole lot about that. But in my mind, I want to think that maybe even young Jack had this environmentalist streak in him, and he viewed the industry in a way that compelled him to kind of work for the authorities in that way. So after that, he works some different jobs, and in let's see, he works a few different jobs, and then in 1893 he signs on with a sealing schooner, right, which kind of alludes to our what we read this month. And he signed on and sailed to Japan with this sealing schooner. When he came back to Oakland, America was in the middle of the worst economic depression it had had up to that time. And he found it. He worked some jobs, a jute mill, which I looked up what that was, but I really don't remember now. And then he also worked at the power company. And what he was doing for the power company was shoveling coal into the furnaces to create the electricity for Oakland, you know. And so he was shoveling coal for 12 to 16 hours a day, and found out from one of his coworkers that they fired two men to get him to do the job that two guys were doing. So they were paying him $30 an hour or $30 a week. I'll say $30 an hour. I bet he wished he was making $30 an hour to do a job that two men were doing, and they were getting paid $40. So that was kind of his introduction into capitalism and the exploitation of the labor market to increase profits. So whether he loses that job or he quits that job, he becomes a hobo or a tramp. And he gets involved with Coxey's Army, which was a whole big movement that we don't have time to get into. But he spent a few years as a tramp or a hobo. He did 30 days in Erie County Penitentiary for vagrancy, and did a lot of different other things, and eventually just felt like he needed to go back and get some kind of education. And so it is at that point he goes back to Oakland to go to high school. You know, all this time he's done all these things that, you know, I think a grown man would be doing, and he's not really of age yet. So he goes to high school, but he's really not into formal education. He spends a lot of time at the Oakland Public Library reading everything that he can get his hands on. Milton, Darwin, Spencer, Marx, all these big names of folks that we think about, he's consuming. I don't think he ever graduates high school. I didn't find any evidence that he actually graduated high school. He really took some time and studied really hard. Wasn't his wife at the time, but ends up being his first wife, kind of helps tutor him to be able to pass the entrance exam at UC Berkeley. And so he gets into college, but he stays there for maybe about a semester before he has to drop out due to financial reasons. And the whole time he's working, when he started going back to high school, he was working at the high school as a janitor to kind of sustain himself while he was pursuing his academic career. It's after he drops out of Berkeley, UC Berkeley, that his brother-in-law in 1897 decides to go to the Klondike on the gold rush, and Jack joins him. And this is the time in his life that London said kind of made him who he was. And a lot of scholars kind of agree with that, saying that not only did it kind of make him a man, but it also made him an author. It gave him the stories to tell. And there's a lot of good stuff to talk about during that time, as far as his development. But overall, it was a horrible experience for Jack, physically, as far as his health goes. It might have been great for him intellectually, but physically, it was a hard thing to do anyways. And I would encourage everybody to kind of go back and do some research on the gold rush during the 1890s and really see what it was like compared to this kind of romanticized Hollywood version that maybe I think of when I think about the period. But it was horrible. And you are in nature. There is no kind of buffer. And that idea that London came up with of the white noise of nature, or the white silence, he really experienced that there. He ended up coming down with scurvy, which is a disease that you get because you don't eat fresh vegetables. They didn't have the fresh fruits and vegetables in their diet, and so he comes down with scurvy, loses 4 teeth, and has to come back home, or he's gonna die pretty much. When he returned to California in 1898, he really started working to get published. He had this idea that he was not going to sell his body anymore. He had kind of been beaten down by the Klondike, and he had resolved to make his living selling his mind. And so when he got back, he really focused on writing and trying to get published. He struggled with that at first, and it wasn't, and got some things published, but was not paid as he should have been, which kind of happened a lot to early artists, authors included. But finally was paid for one of his stories, 1,000 Deaths, by a magazine, The Black Cat. And it's interesting, Jack London really came along at the right time in history for him. In the late 19th century, we have this industrial explosion that's been going on, and the technology for printing and publishing companies had advanced, and this new market emerged for these periodicals and these magazines. And so it really gave London this outlet, or this platform, for his art. And so it's just a little bit of serendipity of being in the right place at the right time on that. He kept on writing short fictions and submitting them to magazines and being published and getting paid and making his living as a writer. And in 1900, he sells he sells The Call of the Wild, and makes the equivalent of $97,000 off of selling that book. So the boy made it, you know what I mean? Coming from what he came from and the life that he had had up to that point, he had made it. And that was in 1900, So he has a great literary career, makes a lot of money, but he also spent it really fast. He enjoyed drinking. He enjoyed smoking. He enjoyed riotous living, you might say, that we might think pirates and sailors may be accustomed to. He was married twice. His first wife Elizabeth May Mattern, like I said, she helped him. She really helped him kind of focus his intellectual life and helped him study for that test to get into UC Berkeley. And although he never graduated with any diploma from anywhere that I could find, during that time he spent a lot focused in literature and in philosophy and in the natural sciences and in religion, and that time really helped shape him a little bit. He had two children, two daughters, Joan and Bessie, and he was a loving father, but his lifestyle did not match up with his first wife. She was not free and carefree and just kind of fun loving. She was more strict and more of a teetotaler type vibe. And so their lifestyles just didn't match up. And eventually they were divorced. And she really didn't let the girls spend a lot of time with Jack other than picnic outings and taking them up for ice cream and stuff like that. And he's kind of was known to be a loving father, but just not very involved. And from what I kind of read about him and stuff that he wrote, I think that kind of really bothered him, that he wanted to be more involved in his kid's life and even ended up feeling like the only thing that they wanted from him was money. And that probably wasn't true, but we all can understand how that perception kind of gets developed. He was divorced in 1904. In 1905, he marries his second wife, who was really the love of his life, Charmian Kittredge. And she kind of hung around in the literary circle that London and some other authors had developed around Oakland and really fit the lifestyle. And she was an adventurer with Jack. And later on, when he built a sailing boat to travel the world, she went with him. She traveled across the Pacific Ocean and visited Hawaii and other Polynesian islands with Jack and was his partner, his mate, his woman and his mate. You know what I mean? And she kind of exemplified that for him. And they were living kind of an adventurer lifestyle. During that time, he had bought his ranch in Sonoma, California, which is a beautiful area. If you ever get to go to Sonoma County, California, it is beautiful. And he had the Beauty Ranch, I believe it was called. And that is where he engaged in this sustainable agriculture. And he had it. He was working on things. He spent a lot of money getting it set up. And eventually died in a home there from kind of the end stages of kidney disease, but really kind of brought on by his lifelong battle with alcoholism. And they had to come home from one of their expeditions in the Pacific Ocean because his health was so bad. And at the time when he was dying, he was taking morphine to ease the pain. And there's really, it's really unclear whether it was the disease. It was an attack of uremia, which is part of late stage renal disease or kidney failure. And it's very painful. And so it's unclear whether he died because of that or if he intentionally overdosed himself with morphine because of the pain. Don't really have much information than that on his death. You know, Jack London had an extremely full life. You know, he was only 40 when he died. And we haven't even scratched the surface on all that he did. He was a war reporter. He was in the Japanese Russo War, went down to the Mexican Revolution. I mean, really lived his life, right? But because of that life, he suffered many ailments and injuries, as well as developing alcoholism. And that's really what led to his death. You know, just as much as we can look up to him, and I look up to him for that fullness of life, is also kind of what brought on his demise. So the Sea Wolf. The Sea Wolf was originally published in 1904, and it's a fun book. There's a lot in there. It's said that he actually met a captain, Alexander McLean, I think it was, in that bar when he was a young man who was just known for his abject cruelty and helped inspire our main protagonist. Seawolf was received fairly well, but the contemporary critics had some of the same critique we had when we talked about it. So, Tommy, give us a little brief overview of the Seawolf.
So in the beginning of the story, we have our main character is a gentleman named Humphrey Van Weyden, one of those. He's he describes himself as a gentleman by trade, by lifestyle. He's not accustomed to hard labor or anything like that. He's on a boat taking this short trip from San Francisco to Sausalito, and there's an accident on the water. Humphrey winds up adrift in San Francisco Bay on a life preserver until the point where he's about ready to give up, you might say, and he's picked up by a passing ship that winds up being a sealing schooner. It's on its way from San Francisco to Japan to hunt the great seal herd. I guess that's what they did every year during this season. So being kind of wealthy, maybe upper class gentleman, he's thinking when he gets on the ship, oh man, I've been saved. You know, these guys just rescued me from the ocean. Now let me pay you for a day's time, couple of days' time, and run me back to the shore, and then you can be on your way. The captain has no intention of taking him ashore. He's basically forced into servitude on the ship. Now, it's not like slavery. He's going to be paid, but he's going to be forced to work as the cabin boy. They just had a mate pass, so everybody's getting promoted, whether they liked it or not. And that was when our main character, Humphrey, saw the first flash of violence from the captain, which is a theme throughout the story. He ruled his ship with an iron fist, you might say, and he was a strong character to say the least, whereas Humphrey is a weak, we called him soft in the reading. You know, he's a pushover. He referred to himself as a sissy, or he'd been referred to as a sissy growing up, this character Humphrey, and he's on this ship now with a man who is he even refers to him as a predator as time goes on, and the captain reminds him, well, they call me Wolf, Captain Wolf Larson, and the moniker was earned through his actions. He's violent. He's a killer as far as that goes. He does whatever he has to do to keep things in line, and his main focus is making the money. The captain, he's not going to be deterred from that mission during the sealing season. And then as the story goes on, you have all the elements you like to see as far as the adventure and the violence out on the ocean. There's a little maybe a little mutiny from time to time, maybe a little romance, you might say, later on, as they encounter different characters as the story goes on. But the main theme, I think, is the fact that this Humphrey, who's been kind of lived a posh lifestyle up to this point, you know, he's never had a callus on his hands. He's forced to work on this ship, and the captain, it seems like, even though he's a cruel individual, he's taken this opportunity to make a man out of Humphrey, who's already a grown man, 35 years old. But Wolf tells him he's never had to, you don't have legs. Because you've never had to stand on your own, too. You stand on your daddy's, you stand on your lawyer's legs. So by the time the story comes closer to the end, Humphrey's character has grown and developed. He's grown his legs.
Yeah.
And it's a really nice transition to read. The captain makes a man of him, whether he likes it or not. And at the same time, that transition also leads to some conflict, you might say. It's not always a hostile relationship between Humphrey and Wolf, but it's not a friendly relationship either. It's a dangerous situation for Hump. Hump, they call him throughout the story. It's a dangerous situation for him in particular. But yeah, it's an entertaining story. I had a good time reading it. What do you think, bro?
Yeah, man, I do think it was very entertaining, and I think it was right along with what Jack London was doing. Right, he created a story that was for mass appeal. Right, this is something that your middle class housewife could sit and read and be entertained, or your middle class breadwinner husband at the time, can come home and at the end of the day and be entertained by this thing. And like you said, it had all the elements on the adventure on the high seas, right?
Yep.
Shipwrecks, mutinies,
Right.
damsels in distress, all of that, right, was certainly presented in this piece. But like we talked about, and like we know about Jack London, he was an outspoken advocate, right? And he made a mission to make these products that could be sold to the mass public, right? But was also preaching kind of some more philosophical and sociological ideals. What do you think about that aspect of it? And I think if you remember what I said when we first started looking at this thing, like whatever Jack is talking about, that's not what he's really talking about, right? So what did you think about that aspect of it? And we ain't got to go into detail, but
Right. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that because it is worth mentioning as far as the description of the story that the captain is not just a brute; he's a self-taught philosopher. They get into some really deep conversations about life and maybe the meaning of life, purpose, and that sort of thing. Afterlife, they have a good discussion
the
on that.
soul, right?
Yeah, the soul.
What is
That's a thing
humanity?
because the captain has educated himself to a really high level through his reading, and now he's got this gentleman on board who can actually relate to some of the things that he's read. They can have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
He's a scientist. He's an inventor. That's another thing that the captain has going on, and at the same time, he's a guy that if there's even a slight hesitance to follow his order, he's knocking the wind out of a guy at a moment's notice, just doubling them over until they just agree to do what he says. So, but yeah, I think it's something that Jack wrote for everybody. It's a huge audience that could read this and get some pleasure out of it.
Yeah. And I thought it was really interesting in that because some of it is veiled, but really not so much. I remember kind of, and we talked about it, but at the kind of opening scene with Humphrey on the Martinez, I believe was the boat he was passing on. He was sitting there commenting on how great the division of labor was, right? And how great it was that different people could be trained to do their job and they didn't have to worry about anybody else's job. But kind of through this development with Wolf Larson and from him kind of finding his own legs, he is forced to do every job on the boat eventually. There is no division of labor. That goes out the window, right? And so there's a lot of different kind of comments on that workers' rights issues and maybe some of those socialist issues. But then also what they're out there doing. They're on a sealing expedition, right? They are hunting seals, and so it's also a environmentalist diatribe or expose at the industrialization of this field. And so that was very interesting. It's also very interesting how he portrays the feminine archetype in this story, where maybe there is some of that stereotypical dainty, frail, feminine archetype, but also very strong, right? And a bit of a commanding feminine archetype, right?
So strong mind, and then what do you call her? The main female character, Lily Dainty, or something along those lines, like a flower, you know. But
Yeah,
like she was respectable though through the way she handled herself, the way she communicated.
yeah. And you know, not to give a huge details in the story because we want folks
Right.
to go read it.
Right.
But through a time when they are shipwrecked, she becomes a mate. She is, you
Yeah.
know, she is a peer, a partner, a cohort, not just someone to
Hmm.
be taken care of. And so I think there's some important kind of feminist themes in there as well, you
Yeah.
know. So yeah, man, he's really dealing with a lot of stuff. It's a really interesting book. It's fast moving, right? Fast paced, a
Hmm.
lot of adventure. Um, as far as your review or your critique, what would you say to somebody else?
Give it a read. I mean, I enjoyed it. I think this is one that's good for entertainment purposes. You can read it, take it at face value, and you'll enjoy a good story. You know, if you choose to look at it a little deeper, then there's more to gain. I'd say that's the case a lot of times, no matter what you're reading. But we talked about some themes in our private conversation about like the duality of man and man versus nature, and just the internal conflict. Do these characters, as polar opposite as they are, do they represent two sides of the same coin? Are they both kind of representative of different sides of the same man, even? And some really interesting stuff. I enjoyed it. I hope that other people are able to read this and get that same feeling from it, if they're not, even though they're not involved in the middle of our conversation on it, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
But yeah, it's a good read. Jack London's a great author. I mean, I know you got a good intro at the beginning of this video about him. You know, we definitely enjoy reading him. The Sea Wolf, Call of the Wild, White Fang, all those Jack London classics, I guess you say.
yeah. What?
Can't go wrong as far as I'm concerned. He sets the scene, he describes things so well. You can really picture it. It's easy to follow along with. Good read, good story.
And then also, and I agree with you with all that you said. And then to add to that, what I really like about Jack London is his use of prose and his use of phonetic spelling to create that everyday language, right?
Right.
And it's like something that we talked about. You know, on this ship, there's people from all different nationalities. And it's like the way that Jack wrote it, you can hear the accents
That's
in the
right.
text. You know what I mean? And that's
Mhm.
one of my favorite things about Jack London is his ability to communicate that natural, everyday language in kind of this sophisticated way. Um, the only thing that other thing that I would add, which is a bit of a critique, well, I guess I have two critiques. One, he could have maybe disguise some of his political rhetoric better, but then maybe he wasn't trying to. That's fine. The other critique I could have would be the ending, right? For as much action and activity in the story, it ends on a kind of anticlimactic scene.
A
Would
little
it?
flat.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a common critique of this work. That's what folks said when it came out. But
Yep.
and we talked about that, and not it did kind of leave the story flat, but it also kind of left opportunity for a follow up, either by London or another author, or even some undergrad student somewhere, right, for a writing
The
prompt.
thing that you see that technique pretty commonly at the end of a lot of major motion pictures. And now, you go to the movies and you have a great action packed thing. And then at the end, it's like, okay, it comes to a close. You're like, wait a minute, but did it? Right?
Are they
There's
going
an
to make another
opportunity.
one?
There's an opportunity for a sequel there. Yeah, it depends
Yeah.
on how much money they can squeeze out of it.
Yeah, and I
That's
would
typically the
think
answer.
that London was probably thinking in that way,
Yeah.
a little bit. I mean, this was what he did for a living, and
Right.
there was a great paradox in Jack London where he was an outspoken socialist and an advocate for the proletarian, so to speak.
Hmm.
He enjoyed making money.
Right.
He enjoyed having things, you
Hmm.
know, um, and you know, was a bit unapologetic about that.
Right.
Um, and but there's a whole conversation of who is that struggle against. Is it the corporation? Is it the individual? That's not something that we have really time to go into. But there
Right.
is that paradox that is found within London, and what you speak to as far as that duality of man.
Mhm.
Yeah, cool stuff. So,
So,
closing thoughts on the Sea Wolf or Jack London.
well, the T Wolf, I think I pretty much gave my thoughts on that. It's a good read, enjoyable. I think it's an entertaining story. You'll get a kick out of it if you pick it up and give it a read. Uh, and I wanted to say, as far as on Jack London, we've said before, and we've reviewed enough of his contemporaries, I guess, at this point to make a little bit of a judgment. There's levels to this, like anything with the writing, and we've said that before. That there's levels to the skills, and Jack is at the top.
There's a
He's at the
reason he's
top.
considered the
Yeah,
great American
Jack London.
writer.
Exactly. There's a
Yes.
reason, and I mean that's not to take away from other guys. There's other guys at that level too, but uh, there's many other people that get a lot of read that are not as high level as Jack London.
Yes, yes, I concur. So, looking forward, we've started another book. Tell the folks what we're looking at next.
So our next read is going to be, well, I said it's going to be, it actually is. We've already started reading Their Eyes Were Watching God by an author named Zora Neale Hurston. She became, would you say, famous during the Harlem Renaissance? That's when she found her success, I guess. She's emerged from the Harlem Renaissance period. Um, so this will be our first female author, I guess, that we will review, which is
I think it's the first
it's
black
interesting,
author too,
yeah.
right?
Do what?
They all of them before have been white men.
I think that's accurate too. Yeah, not because we set out to make it that way. That's just how it unfolded, I guess. We started reading
Yeah.
some of our favorite guys, and went on from there. But so this will be adding a little diversity, I guess, to our uh, book reviews.
Yeah, and we talked about wanting to do that, and it Hurston is a natural flow for me from
Yeah.
Jack London, right? And we've talked about that, and it's another thing that I'm glad that we're doing Hurston, or I would have failed to mention this about Jack London. Um, even though London was not educated, highly formally educated, he was really a progressive intellectual and really on the cutting edge of sociological research. and even what now is considered ethnography or an ethnographic research. What Jack London did with the people of the abyss, and if you don't know, go check it out, right? But what he did with the people of the abyss was really the first ethnographic research,
Yeah.
right?
Social experiment type thing. I
Yeah,
think we refer to it like that too, right?
yeah, and just for folks that maybe don't know, an ethnographic research experience is when you embed yourself within the community. You don't necessarily take surveys, you don't use these formal techniques and devices, but you spend time
Yeah.
within the community.
Go there
And
and
from
live and work and all that sort of thing.
yeah, and take
Right.
notes, and you know you may do some interviewing, but it's a little more informal. And so Zora Neale Hurston, while she is a great author of fiction, I was introduced to her from my study in sociology, and she was really a great academic. Zora Neale Hurston, you don't know, go check her out. Great
Yeah.
academic, one of the early ethnographers to do it formally, to say, this is what I'm doing, and do it in a formal scientific way, right? And so uh, she spent a lot of time doing this ethnographical research, and that's one connection to Jack London. The other is her use of that phonetic spelling to create that natural language. And man, Jack was really good at it. Zora was really good at it. And
Say one more thing about Jack, just before we get too far from that. When you were saying about him not being highly educated, formally educated, we have stated before in these other videos that there's many different types of education, and when it comes to education outside of school, Jack was about as high level as you can get. That's
yeah,
where I think that's where all of that other the intellectualism, the wisdom through his life experience really took his it really took him to another level as far as education goes. So there's different types of education, and whereas he may not have went that far through formal schooling, he was he had a PhD in life.
yeah. I would agree with that. And Miss Hurston kind of had both,
Yeah.
you know, and maybe she's not obscure as I think she is. Like I said, I was introduced to her as an academic first, and then an artist. But this book that we're going to review, Their Eyes Were Watching God, is said to be like Oprah's favorite book. I heard her say that. Yes, yes. And there was actually a film starring Halle Berry made 2000s, early 2000s, maybe somewhere around somewhere in the first decade or the second decade of the 21st century. I don't recall. I've not seen the film, but great writing, deep thinker, a lot of good stuff, and I look forward to reviewing it.
So,
Closing thoughts.
uh, well, becoming kind of a recurring thing, but get your library cards updated, check some books out, read along with us, follow the discussion, or comment, send some recommendations our way, anything like that. Participate with us, man. We'd be thankful for that.
Yeah, it'd be a blessing. Tommy, I'm really blessed by engaging in this with you, brother. I really appreciate it. This is Book Club with Tommy Dixon, Maxwell 3000 Productions. I am Maxwell 3000. Peace and love.